Okay, good evening. Shall we start? So I think I don't need a microphone in classroom of this size. So for those who attend the lecture through Zoom, are you able to hear me? Thank you very much. I think I've introduced myself both in a lecture in last semester and also on Tuesday to most of you. This is a course on understanding the modern Metropolis. In fact, you can take this as a general introduction to theories and perspective approaches in the study of the city. So in this first lecture, perhaps I'll have a brief overview of what we are going to introduce in this 13-week lectures. And perhaps I'm not quite sure whether this section will take the whole 3 hours. The first part, I'll focus more on the approaches and what kind of topic we will cover to give you an overview. And the second part of this section, I'll have some kind of housekeeping sort of issues, how we organize the presentation, how we organize the discussions. So perhaps I presume most of you have read the course outline, so you should have some kind of idea on that. So in case you need to clarify something, I mean, there's some time at the end of this section that you can do it. So understanding the modern metropolis and what we call urban, in fact, is the study of the city. So I think in the semester A, many of your courses has already covered that. But let me go back a little bit from the more fundamental. Why we need to study the city and what's special about city. So of course, urban is a term we invented 100 or 115 years ago, when the world undergone a very rapid transformation with most of the people began with living in the countryside, and then they moved to the city. So about 100 years ago, we have this term being created, what we call urbanism. Urbanism will describe the way of life in city. So what do we mean by the way of life in city? Because when city become to emerge, next lecture I'll do a little bit finer to differentiate on that, because in fact, city is not a new invention. So cities is as always human civilization. So later on, in next lecture, you'll learn that. But what is special is about the development of cities in a modern form. what we mean by modern form is basically the introduction of capitalism with the advancement in technology. And unlike in traditional and cities in the very distant past, modern cities has a very different form in terms of the organization, in terms of the ideology, in terms of the lifestyle. So that's why people moving from the countryside to the city, they need a very, very big adaptation. So that's why we need to study the city. But more important is the social relations of people who move to the city also undergone a very fundamental change. In the countryside, it was basically people are related by blood. So they belong to a clan and people know each other since birth. But in city, what we call it, secondary contact began to emerge. So basically people in the city, most people in the city that they meet every day, even they work with every day, are complete strangers to each other. So we need to be adaptive and custom to a scenario that people you meet or people surround you, none of them or very few of them you know, not to say that you have deep interaction with them. So it changed not just the way we interact with people, but all the mentality, all the adaptive behavior, all have to undergone a very abrupt change. So later on, we have a discussion on the internal migration in mainland China, and that will illustrate very vividly this kind of change. Of course, I mean, the change is more than what I said. What is special about the city, contrast to the countryside, is the city is more diversified. So whereas in the countryside, you live in the village, and everything is so mundane, ordinary, because the change is very, very slow, and people are quite homogeneous. Whereas in cities, we have a diversity of people in terms of age, in terms of their life stage, in terms of occupation, nearly in terms of everything. Not to mention recently, because of international migration, the homogeneity in some of the country began to undergo a very basic transformation. So you have people who believe in a different religions, who speak a different language, who have a very different culture. And this the diversity may be something bad for people who have difficulties to adapt, but it may be good because that would act as a driving force for change, because you cannot keep your old thinking, you cannot keep your old behavior, so you're being forced to think new things because of such diversity. And that will intensify the society and cultural change, so something that is good. So that's why people, particularly young people who like to live in city, because of that stimulation, of that sort of pressure for change. But in one way, because of the city being developed as a result of the improvement of economic efficiency, where later on we'll have a better coverage on that. So some people have better life in city. But of course, I mean, that is something I do not have to elaborate, because most of you may have undergone this sort of change. But city also holds something that is much, much worse than in the countryside about human living condition. So we have slum, we have people who are very poor or very difficult to survive. But more important is, city can promise something, a better life for us. Or at least in the past, we experience that the advancement in technology and economic development really bring good life to most of the people in the city. So that's why city is so attractive. So in the study of the cities, we can study the city in its two different dimensions. First is we can take city as an entity. Take, for example, an entity is something real. So we study the population size of city, the density of the city, the economy of the city, its economic base, is economic activity, its economic development. So it's something real. And also city can also be studied as some kind of administrative entity. So the boundary of the city, relation between different cities in this administrative hierarchy. And in this way, in fact, the study of the city may take some kind of what we call functional definition. That is important sometimes in a study of the city. Take, for example, if we study Beijing, so what do you mean by Beijing? So of course, in China, it's very, very clear because Beijing has a boundary. So within that city boundary, that is Beijing. But this, in fact, may also create a complication for the study. I think, for example, in fact, when we study Beijing, as if Beijing is a city. But all of you know Beijing better than myself. But in fact, most part of Beijing, they are very rural. They have peasants, they have people who keep their peasant life for the whole of their life. So if you think that in some kind of remote district in Beijing, and if you compare with the sort of proper of Beijing, they are two different worlds. So do you when you study Beijing, which part of Beijing are you looking at? A similar example is with Chongqing. Chongqing has relatively recently been promoted as what we call a provincial level so-called city. But before that, the area now we call it Chongqing. In fact, they are just rural so-called counties of Sichuan province. So that makes the so-called this entity a little bit complicated. But on the contrary, when we mention about the study of cities in other countries, take for example, when we said we study London, we study Vancouver, when we study Toronto. But if you look at, for instance, Toronto is just a very small area. Because the way they organize it administratively is they have a Toronto city, but outside Toronto, they have other cities, called other name, ruled by other government. But in fact, those areas, they form a organic sort of entity. The most classic examples, in fact, is Los Angeles. We all know that Hollywood is in Los Angeles, but that's not true because Hollywood is a separate city. It doesn't belong to Los Angeles. So in other countries, when we study a city, we are not exactly adopting the same definition as the city in China or in some other country. They have a very definite administrative boundary. So in fact, when we study Los Angeles, when we study Vancouver, in fact, we are studying the organic portion of the area that are linked together functionally. So instead of the administrative criteria of defining the city, we may use a functional definition of the city. So perhaps in some of the literature you have read before, they will say that I'm studying Greater Vancouver. I'm studying Greater Toronto, because Vancouver is just a very small city. Then across the river of that, there is something many Chinese concentrated is, for instance, called Richmond. Richmond is a city on its own, but it is linked to Vancouver, just like different districts in Beijing. So London was also the case until about a decade ago. London is consisted of about 30 something districts. They do not belong to each other. Until recently, they form a Greater London Council that unite them together. So that is something that perhaps we need to make some kind of comparison on that, because this division would also create some kind of debate, particularly on the rate of urbanization. So there is still a controversy whether China has a higher rate of urbanization than India, because China has a administratively defined boundary for cities. So in fact, within the city like Beijing, to a lesser extent Shanghai, they have a lot of rural area, whereas in other places, they will be defined as countryside, not the city. Whereas India is just the opposite. India is divided into sort of different area, which the city itself is relatively small. But the village near to the city are in fact the suburb of the big city. So there is a controversy whether of the urbanization rate. Of course, I mean, there may be sort of minor technical details, but I think you need to aware of that. We study city because city is fast growing. Which city it is? Is it Shenzhen? I'm not quite sure. This is Hanoi, Vietnam. So it's also as fast growing as in China. So cities are becoming more glamorous. So that is the all those sort of glamorous building and construction in Dubai. But as I just mentioned before, city has the best thing, but also have the worst thing. So in many cities, particularly in developing world, there are a lot of slums. So there's a slum in India, but we also have very so-called notorious so-called slum in Latin America. We study cities of high density, like Hong Kong and some big cities in China, but that is, in fact, that's not the norm. Most of the cities we describe in the literature are very low density, very low density. So that is also something that you need to differentiate or acknowledge when we are saying that we study the city. Cities are not uniform. In fact, they have very big difference in terms of population size, in terms of the population density, and also the density of the built environment. But city can also be studied not as an entity, something that are concrete, some are materialistic. City can also be studied as a quality. So later on, we will enter into more sort of investigation, examination of the city of its quality, more than what we call the physical entity of the city. Because cities is something that have an impact on an individual. So they have meanings, they will attach value to where they live. And city is also associated with different way of life. So in some study of the cities, we ask people to have a mental map of the cities, what we call the cognitive mapping of the city, to show the perception, to show their association and collective memory of the city. city has a different way of life. So as I mentioned before, the adaptation to city life is a very common area of study, so in urban studies, because not just migrants from the rural area, when they go to the city, they have to adapt. In fact, city dwellers, even when they are raised and born in the city, they need to constantly adapt to the new development of the city. So that is something that the study of city is so exciting. So we come back again to that so-called urbanism. So the urban life, in fact, is a ever-changing environment that people need to continually adapt. The study of the city or the study of the urban, we would say that is not a very unified and single discipline. But in many branches of the social sciences, all of them have a very special so-called branch that have an interest on the city. Geography, you can have urban geography. Sociology, you have urban sociology. Politics, you have urban politics. Anthropology, you have urban anthropology. So the city is, in fact, is one very common focus of many disciplines. We may not be able to study the city from all those disciplines because of the limit of time. So we only select a few dimensions or approach to the city that we think are important, and then perhaps you should have some knowledge of that. Of course, the earliest and the easiest study of the cities is to study city as a space, because cities occupy space. And before we have anything about the city, we need to use that space. So how the space is organized is perhaps of the earliest interest of people who want to study the city. But city is also a social organization, because I just mentioned that relation in the cities are the connection with strangers, and there are very different social institutions being created in the city, which is a much more complicated than similar institution in the rural area. But city also contain something that are invisible but important. It's what we call power. So a critical perspective in studying the city is trying to unfold the exercise of power, and not how power is being exercised in cities or between the institutions. But of course, the economic side is also very important. On the spatial side, in fact, it is perhaps the first interest in the city, because there is one very important consideration when we need to establish a city, its location. Because without the decision for a specific location, there's no city. So that is why the spatial approach to the city is the earliest and perhaps one of the most important, because we need that space to contain a city. But once a city is settled in one location, there's also a need to expand, and also a need to change how the space within the city is used. So that's why the location, the spatial use are of very fundamental importance to a study of the city. So in fact, this tradition started very early in the early 20th century with Pratt, who studied a small area. But of course, earlier than that is about the historical, tracing the historical development of the cities in terms of its choice in location. And later on, Jefferson, in the late 30s, studied city size. is interested in why some city can grow, but others cannot. So what are the relation between city size and the location and the economic activity? So perhaps that is something of interest at that time, because you have cities being created, but each city also want to grow. So related to that is a theory, what we call the central place theory, developed by Christella. So why some cities can grow, why some city can grow big? Because of the location. So because its location is central, but central to what? So that is something that the study or the research want to uncover. And that connect to a large study during the similar time is about the economic activity in relation to the location. But of course, now these are more or less become common sense to many of us, because many of you may have studied geography in your secondary school, and in fact, those knowledge are directly related to the research at that time in the 20s and the 30s, and it's already become very stable. So that is being taught in secondary school. And similarly, in the 50s and in the 60s, the change had becoming more rapid because of the advancement in technology. So the innovation diffusion is also something that we explain why some city grow, why some city will decline. So the location is not just about the location on map. It's also about, as I just mentioned, when you have the location, you will plan the land use, you plan the expansion. So what kind of urban form it is within the city is also the concern of what we call the spatial aspect of the city. And with that, there are some theories that locate those urban forms with the development of the surrounding. So there is something what we call the urban ecology, putting the development of the city in the ecological system. And later on, we will come back on that urban ecology when we study this, when we mention about the social approach to the study of the city. And in fact, this locational tradition has developed and into a more sophisticated way when in recent decades, we have the extensive use of what we call the GIS, so the data. So with the GIS data, we're able not just to study the city as a whole, but we are also able to study every building, every activity within the city in the what we call the micro area, the small area, because of that GIS system. And that GIS system further leapfrog with the release of satellite data. So with the satellite data, we can get very cheap data on a massive scale and also over a very long time. So with the satellite data, in fact, we can study the change of land use. We can study the change of vegetation coverage, for instance. We can study the degree of pollution with those sort of satellite pictures. And now it's even faster in processing the data when we can connect those GIS data, satellite images with artificial intelligence. So in fact, now the spatial study of the data of the city is perhaps the fastest growing and also getting significance. So if you have the knowledge on GIS, and perhaps this is an area that you can go, and particularly with the emphasis of what we call the big data. Another branch of study of the city, of the location, about the spatial use of so-called the various components of the city is something what we call the postmodern approach to the study of city. We will return at the end of our sections because it takes a very different look on how the space in the city is organized. With the advancement of information technology, with globalization. So that is a very sort of different approach in putting the data and also engaging analysis about all those locations. City can also study as a social organization. So we just mentioned that when people move from the countryside to the city, the social relations have changed. Not just the social relations have changed, the whole institution have changed. So people are related to each other in a very different way. So many things that doesn't exist in the countryside now exist extensively in cities. And people have to face it every day in sort of their life. This will embrace the formation of new social groups. So in the countryside, you only have family, you have clans, and that's it. And your daily activity is to do some agricultural activity, which mostly on your own or together with your immediate family, and occasionally you need other member of your clan to help. But that is something that go on routinely from year to year. Whereas in city, because of the diversity, because of the need for a variety of different activities, so different groups have changed. You work in big companies, and big companies have cooperation with other companies. You have a lot of other leisure activities. You have a lot of so-called other commercial activities. You have a mass scale transport system. These are all those social groups you need to encounter. And more important is because of the diversity in class, in race, in gender, the social connection have completely overhauled. And even in the neighborhood, even in the community, you need some kind of reorganization. Because unlike in your traditional village, people are connected to each other and they are being bound by some kind of social norms and convention. Whereas in most cities, this kind of norm and convention is non-existent. But of course, I mean, these have a difference in different countries who have different history. So in Europe, this tradition almost being held because of the very slow development of the city. And even cities is developed, people tend to move to the city, and people in the same village, they stick together. So the change is quite gradual. But in North America, particularly in the United States, there is a completely different story. Because the United States is being formed by migrants. And the migrants are from different countries, particularly from different countries in Europe. So they bring along different culture, different language, and this cohesion issue become a very important issue. And in the United States, the country have never been stable. Because in the 19th century, there is a big wave of migration from the east to the west. And also towards the end of the 19th century, because of the manipulation of the slave in the South, there's a lot of so-called African American who moved from the South to the North. So in fact, the degree of migration is comparable, if not more intense than the internal migration in China in recent years. So that will have a big impact on the neighborhood and also on the community and create a lot of social problems. But in the study of city, I just mentioned that because of the experience in Europe and North America are slightly different. So there are, in fact, two traditions in the social perspective in the study of the city. In Europe, in fact, the study of the cities started with a few, in fact, quite renowned so-called scholars, like Karl Marx, to study the class situation in the city, but its emphasis is not on the city per se, but more on the class division within the city, particularly about the conflict between those capitalists and the ordinary workers. Whereas Tony, as a German sociologist, his emphasis is on the adaptation of people from the rural area who move to the city, whereas they have to encounter different type of community. So perhaps his best known concept are the German words about community. The Gemeinschaft is, I think, is something rural. People are related by blood, by convention, whereas the Gesellschaft, I'm not quite sure I pronounced the German correctly, is about the urban environment, which I've just mentioned that you have to encounter strangers, and you do not have any consensus on the norms, on the conventions. So these are the description of him at that time. But what he wants to promote is to create this kind of more organic and cohesive community in the city. That may be possible in Europe because of the gradual migration. Whereas Durkheim will also emphasize on social cohesion and social solidarity, because we found that cohesion and solidarity, in fact, not only city cannot survive, the nation itself will be put in risk because of the lack of cohesion among people in the same country. And this match, in fact, with the wave of what we call nation building in the European country at that time, in the 19th century and the early 20th century. So its concern is on whether people are being to create organic solidarity from what he described as the mechanical solidarity among people in the cities and in the neighborhood. Weber is famous of his study on capitalism and also on bureaucracy, but he also have described something on the urban community, although that's not that well known. Whereas in North America, because I just mentioned that, North American, particularly the United States, started with a country of migrants. And they bring together people with different culture, different language. And what they want to settle in the United States is to get a better life. So they are more pragmatic, or there's no social norm that exists. And as you know that in the 7th century, 18th century, the United States is quite lawless. So force is the order that everybody have to adhere to, and when they want to get benefit for themselves. So in the early 20th centuries, in fact, a group of scholars in the University of Chicago have started a series of the study of the city. So now it's known as the Chicago School. And the approach of the city is something what we call social ecology. So it's not about the integration of people in the city with the physical environment, but rather they borrow the analysis in the ecological study to the study of the city. Because when in nature, different species, in fact, they compete with each other for space. And that study have a long history, and also they have also have some theories on that. So the Chicago School simply borrowed those so-called analogy and those approach to the study of the city. So later on, we will have a more elaboration on the social ecology so-called approach. And in fact, this will emphasize on competition, whereas the European tradition, they will emphasize more on the change and more on the adaptation. So the representative figure of Robert Park, who began his life in the study of the formal structure of the city, and whereas he treat the neighborhood or the community as venue of tolerance and freedom. So that is something as a result of competition, but it's also a way you arrive at some kind of consensus and settle in some form of sort of convention and norms. Wolf is also another scholar in the Chicago School who in fact invented the term urbanism as a way of life. And his pioneer work is to have empirical investigation of social problems. So unlike in the European tradition can trace its root to philosophy. So it's more a normative discussion about change, a conceptual analysis of the change about the organization. Whereas in the Chicago School, they emphasize on empirical study. So they collect data, they may not have theories, but with the data, they can arrive at some kind of generalization. The third approach is something what we call a critical approach. As I just mentioned, critical approach look at the exercise of power, and so look at the cities in a political context. It's differentiated, in fact, from the study of politics or the political side of the city, because the political side of the city may look at the political institution of a city, how city government is being organized, how elections are being taken, but the critical study will look at the power relation specifically. So, in fact, this approach have quite big influence in recent years, particularly about a group of scholars who are skeptical about what they call the democratic society, and also about freedom, about equality. So they also have a close connection with some kind of Marxist theory. So they are called the neo-Marxists. For instance, Henri Lefebvre, a French philosopher, sociologist, we will introduce his theory in a lecture. He analyzed the cities as what we call a circuit of capital. So it's about the capital flow that will create the process of the city. But within that, these are power relations. And his other study is on the social production of space, where he's introduced a concept of spatial triad. Look at the representation of space, representational space, and spatial practice. Try to look at how power is being exercised, how resistance are being developed within that circuit of capital. And David Harvey is another more renowned scholar on that. And his description is on the uneven development of capitalism. Because of the uneven development, in fact, it will base this uneven development to explain some social phenomenon and also why the uneven development of capitalism will create some urban form. So why we have gentrification, why we have urban slums, and these are all because of the uneven development of capitalism. And that uneven development of capitalism, in fact, will put the built environment as a center of resistance and rebellion. So the struggles exist because of the uneven development of capitalism, and this will result in unrest, in resistance. Castells is another more renowned scholar in this approach, and his specific contribution is to look at not just capitalism, but a variation of capitalism, what we call welfare capitalism. Because in most Western and North European countries, the capitalism from the 60s onwards have developed into something that's beyond the description of Karl Marx. So if you say that capitalism will exploit ordinary workers, but in those countries, workers have very high welfare because of the development of welfare state after the Second World War. But this kind of welfare capitalism is not a solution to what Harvey or Lafleur described as some kind of uneven development of the circuit of capital, because underlying that is still the exploitation. But now the struggle and the resistance happen more within the welfare mechanism capitalism regime is something what we call the collective consumption. Because the more the state intervenes into providing welfare, and in fact, this will become the center of contention. So that's why resistance and contention of the ordinary worker now in those countries doesn't concentrate on economic areas. So unlike before the Second World War or even in the early 20th century, there are strides against the exploitation of capitalism. But now, start from the 60s and 70s, all those resistance concentrate on the state provision of welfare. For instance, on housing, on the provision of pension. And he also will look at the sort of different contention in different areas of the collective consumption that has a different mode of development, so being followed by different countries. Logan and Motloff in North America study the city as the exercise of power. And later on, we'll have a lecture on that, on the urban growth machine. So it has a different interpretation of how the so-called capitalist group or the capital interest in cities operate, collaborate, and then take advantage of the system. Economic study of the cities is perhaps also started very early with the study of the economic location analysis and also about the role of the market force in the development of the city. So perhaps one of the more common and also very, common sense knowledge about nowadays is about the comparative advantage of city. So why some city develop, but not other city? Because if cities are able to exploit their relative advantage in a particular area of economic production, they will gain. Whereas others, if they're unable to grab that opportunity, they may lose out. So it also will try to explain economic growth, economic activity, and employment. And to relate with that is also about housing, it's also about property, which is sort of sidetracking, but also belong to that economic sort of approach. And some technical study of the city also belong to sort of this area, although we are unable to touch them in our course. Take, for example, about local finance, about local tax, and that's very important. And now if we study the land market in China, the local finance in China, and that is something that we need to look at. So other approach, like the cultural approach, look at city culture, how city culture is developed, what are the sort of characteristics of the city in terms of culture, or the intention to develop a city into a creative city. So that will integrate culture in the city with the economic development of the city. Maybe Dr. Huang has already covered that in her course, in the city and culture. And the study of the environment, about sustainable cities, about weather change, is also an important topic now in the study of the city. But unfortunately, we may not be able to cover that. Whereas something important that perhaps you need to note, we will particularly point it out in some of our lectures, but in general, nearly all of those theories on the cities are being developed within the context of the developed world, in Europe, in North America. Whereas city in the developing world, what we call city in the global south, as against the country I've just mentioned in Europe and North America, Australia as city in the global north. There is nothing to do with geography. So it's about development. So global north are countries and cities that are rich. Global south are those developing cities in the developing world, which are relatively poor. So that theory mostly arisen from those studies in the global north. Would it apply to a city in the global south is always a debate. And city in this part of the world, in East Asia, in Hong Kong, in mainland China, perhaps it is something in between, because economically, we are closer to the global north. But in terms of the social organization, in terms of the social convention, we may be some way closer to cities in the global south. So that is something that perhaps we need to pay special attention on this. There's no easy solution, but there is something that we need to alert ourselves about the application of those sort of theory from the global north. We cannot categorically say that is unapplicable, because some theories, they may be general, but obviously not all theories. So it's under those contexts we develop this so-called 13 lectures. So we try to introduce a broad introduction of theories and approaches in a particular approach. Take, for example, the social perspective, we call it the social landscape of the city. After a deeper introduction of next lecture about the origin and evolution of the city, to give you some kind of historical sort of context. That is important, because if we want to understand city now, perhaps we need to understand city in the past, as I just mentioned. cities are not new things. The earlier cities, in fact, exist 6,000 years ago. But of course, the city at that time is very, very different from city nowadays. But with that particular general introduction, we also attempt, in fact, I'm not quite sure whether it's successful or not, to illustrate those approach with a specific sort of topic. So on the study of the social landscape, we want to use segregation as a more in-depth discussion on that. So in the spatial landscape of the city, we want to use mobility and migration as one illustration. Although this connection may be not that tight, but we hope that it will extend or intensify your understanding of this approach. The political landscape will look at governmentality. And also the governmentality will also look at the what we call the critical approach in study of the city. And then we will briefly mention about the economic landscape of the city, and we want to use the urbanization and land value to illustrate the economic landscape or the approach in economic landscape. And two other approach we also want to briefly touch on is about globalization and also about the postmodern city, which are something that may be outside of those sort of perspective, but are important issues in our study of the cities in recent years. Okay, perhaps let us have a break of 10 minutes before we continue with some kind of housekeeping. Okay, let us resume our lecture. And up to now, any question or any concern or any problem? That's good. The second section, I want to engage in some kind of housekeeping. But first of all, let me do something that you may have already done in the last semester, but because it's the first time I got in contact with all of you. So in fact, there was also my convention to know you better. So for those in the classroom, let me hand over to the classroom first. They know who you are. They know who you are. So can each one of you take a piece of paper? For those who are in Zoom, you're at home. So get a piece of brand paper. It may better be of A5 size, so half of the A4 size. So perhaps in the top, write down your name. So I'm sure that you did it before, not just once, maybe several times. So every one of us asked similar question, because this is a relatively manageable group. So we are able to know each one of you in more detail. So unlike in my other classes, for instance, on Tuesday, I have 125 students, or I will give up because that's impossible for me to know the 120 something students, but you only have about 49, 50 students. Okay, it's easy. Where you come from? So it's either where you're born or where you're born, where you study, where you stay the longest time. So that's something about you. The city you come from. So are there any student from Hong Kong? Not here. So it's about your city, your neighborhood. What are a few words about the cities? A very brief description about how you think about the city. Just anything. Can you help to draw an animal that you think can represent your cities or the area, the district you stay the most, you have the most intensive attachment. So any animal on that. I'll give you 5 minutes. For those who in Zoom, you also have to do that because that may be an assignment. In fact, it is an assignment, which I'll tell you later what it is. So the animal you're drawing is a white swan. And write that and draw it so that we can see, because I'll ask some of you to come out and present it. And also have to, if you're in Zoom, you have to present in Zoom. So I'm sure that all of you are able to do that. No. But don't worry, imagine you're a child. You're drawing something like a child is something that interesting. Well, for those who are in Zoom, you have to also to do that. Don't worry, because I'll show a name. So if the name, I randomly pick this name. It's not this one, because I haven't started the lucky draw. So for those whose name appear, if you're in the classroom, please come forward and in front of the camera, do some kind of introduction. And if you're in Zoom, show it in your camera, turn on your camera and your mic, and also do some introduction on that. So each time I move, there will be a different name. So that's still not real. So I'm sure most of you are ready on that. And also those on Zoom, you have to be ready on that. So this is a real one. So if your name appear, if you're in the classroom, please come over. If you're in Zoom, please turn on your video and microphone to do your introduction. So that's real. Is it here? So must be in the in Zoom. Yes. Oh, 走了。Well, don't be afraid of that. I know you're here.
Hello, Professor. I'm on Zoom.
Okay, you're very brave. Yeah. Let me give her an encouragement. Can you turn on your sorry?
Should I show you my picture?
Let me
the paper.
Turn off. Okay. Yeah. Please.
Yeah. Can you see me? I'm not so good.
It's a dragon. What is it? What is it? What animal you have drawn?
It's a dragon.
Okay.
Actually. But
so which city you want the dragon to represent?
It's my home city. It's Chongqing.
So why is a dragon?
Because there are two rivers come across Chongqing. One is Long River and the other is Jialing River. And I think that both rivers, they just look like dragons if you look down. So,
okay, yeah, very good, very good. Thank you very much. And
thank you.
Let us pick another one. Oh. Is here? No? let me find him or her. Yes. Oh, disappear. Yes. Yao Shuxin. Are you here? Can you turn on your video and also the microphone? Okay, I think he or she is too shy. Sorry. Okay, let's pick another one. Yeah, hope we can pick somebody in this classroom. Ah, he's here.
Hello, I'm in room. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes. Why I always see your name? Your name appear very often in the recording. Okay, yeah. Can you turn on your video? Yes.
Yeah.
Can you show your the
Okay.
picture you have drawn?
Can you see?
Yes. What is it? It's a duck. A swan.
It's a queen. Yeah. Because my city called Hebei. There your side swan perch on a cliff of mountain, so it called Hebei.
So why is a swan?
Because my city called Hebei. My city is in Henan province. It's called Hebei. There your side a swan perch on the cliff of mountain. So it's called Hebei. I use the swan to stand for my city.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. Thank you. Let's draw another one. I think this is the last one, yeah, because otherwise, I mean, we have no time to have other coverage. Oh. Is it in this room? No.
Yeah. I'm in the room.
Let me find you out.
Could you hear me?
Sorry, have you turned on your video?
Oh, my camera is not very good today. But I can describe the image with you, okay?
Okay, yeah. Can you introduce what kind of animal you have drawn?
I draw a dragon. Because
yeah.
my hometown is Shanxi, and Taiwan is called the City of Dragons. So I draw a dragon in my paper.
Okay, this is very good. Yeah. Sorry, I think we need to continue with other things. Thank you very much. So for those in this room, I'll collect your drawing afterwards. And for those on Zoom, I'll set up a Canvas submission site so that you can upload you can scan your drawing, take a picture, and then upload to Canvas for me to have a look. So it doesn't matter what you draw, because I just want to sort of know you better about where you come from, what is your name. So it doesn't matter. Let's continue with the introduction. Sorry. Okay. Maybe one thing that everybody would concern is about assessment. I mean, what kind of coursework you have to do. So it's clearly written in the course outline. So we have quite a number of assignments you have to do. The first thing is what I call a short introductory paper. We name it L01. It's just 500 words. But the deadline is very soon. It's next week. and it constitutes 5% of the total mark. Later on, I'll mention a little bit more on that. And that's the deadline is next Friday. And from week 3 onward, we will have a class discussion. So we have three discussion in a row. And I'll also have more detail a moment later. And together with that, we need to do what we call a critique of that paper, which is 1,000 words. And it will constitute 15% of the total mark. And the deadline is the 24th of February. Later on, I'll mention more about what paper you have to do. And then from the fifth week onward, we will have half of the section dedicated to student-led presentation. So we have set 7 topics, and this is a team presentation. And connecting with that is an individual paper of 3,000 words, which will constitute about 50% of the mark. So it's the most important sort of assignment you have to do. And connecting with that is the presentation and also about the discussion, which will each constitute about 10% of the mark. And the term paper deadline is 3 weeks after the presentation. So you should have plenty of time in doing that. The remaining 10% is what I call the class test. So remember, it's not a formal test. So we will not have a dedicated section so that you have to do a 2 hours or 1 hour of test. I'll scatter that in some of the classes. And just to help you to recap what we have taught, what you have learned, and some kind of recall of the memory. So that is easy. So don't worry about that so-called that 10%. But it will give you some kind of incentive to pay more attention and to show your understanding. A short introductory paper with 500 words, which is still next week, is something that in fact connected to what I have asked you to do in this section. So write a short paper on a city you are familiar with. It's either the city you were born, stayed the longest, with closest connection, or even with good memories. So in fact, that is some way that I'll try to have some kind of feel about what you write. So just something casual. So you need not to be informative, it need not to be analytic. So you don't have to read a lot of references. You don't have to quote any of such references. Just write out what you think. It's very different from all your other assignments, although it just constitutes a very small percentage. But I just want to have some kind of ideas how you write that so-called casual things. So it is just a descriptive account of the cities, your thinking. So don't feel pressure on that. So perhaps everybody will get not too low marks because of that. We don't have much sort of expectation apart from letting me know what you think. So write something that are genuine and real. Don't make up a story. Because this is a way I want to know you more about that. So it can be something affectionate, it can be something the expression of your thought, your feeling, or just recall some kind of memory. But try to make it in a sort of decent way. So just have a complete sentence and paragraph. So not just point form or scatter writing. So try to make the grammar right, try to make it more elegant in terms of its organization. So try to do that. The second assignment connected to the free paper discussion we have. So from week 3, we have 3 sections of discussion. So each section, we have already assigned a paper for you to read. So everybody have to read the paper. And in the class, you will going to discuss the paper. We will arrange for an in-depth engagement of you to discuss the paper. And I know that you have already have some paper discussion or presentation in semester A, but I'm sure that it will never be enough for you to practice analyzing the data, analyzing the paper, and also to make a presentation. So in this free section, I will allow you to have plenty of time for the presentation. So until then, you know what I'm going to organize that. Because I understand that many of you, even in semester A, you may not have plenty of opportunity for presentation. Perhaps the presentation you all have in semester A put together is just less than half an hour. But that's not enough. That's not enough. You need more practice on that, particularly presentation in English. And we have 3 papers, but you are not asked to write the critique of all papers. You are only asked to write 1 paper as an assignment of 1,000-word critique. And after the last paper discussion section, just like what I did before, I'll draw lots to assign you to a particular paper. And then you only have to do the critique of that paper. So that would not be a heavy work. But you do not know which paper you have to do in advance. So you need to pay attention to all 3 papers. Otherwise, you may not have enough time to complete the assignment, because after the last section, the due date will be very short. Because when you have to write a critique, that may not be enough just to read the paper. You may have to read other associating so-called paper in order to write a good critique. So you need some time in doing that. If you have already read the paper and understand the paper, it's easier for you. But if you just start reading the paper from scratch, after you know which paper you have to work on, you may be a little bit rushed on that. The third assignment is also associating presentation. Is about a presentation, what I call in section PO4 to PO7, which is in section SO, what I call the SO5 to S11. So my other courses will divide you up into different groups. I think we have 49 students. So the new scenario, not ideal, I think it's the only scenario is we divided up the section presentation equally. So we have 7 topics. So that 7 is not an arbitrary number. It's a number because of your class size. So 7 of you will get together to make a presentation, to prepare a presentation. And then the presentation will be about 40, not 46 or 45. So 40 to 45 minutes, and then followed by some discussion. But you need to do an individual paper. And the individual paper is 3,000 words. And you have to do the topic in full, but not only the portion you are responsible in the presentation. And also I understand that 7 is quite a big group in terms of preparation of discussion. So I don't expect the presentation to be very structured or very coherent. As long as the part you're responsible are coherent and also clear and make sense. And more important is connected to the topic and demonstrate that you have to do some reading on that. So that's important. So even if the different part of this presentation is not coherent and they may be contradictory, but that may be a good thing, because I will encourage that if you do not have consensus on the approach, perhaps you can have some kind of internal debate. So one of you may present one view, but it may be opposed by the others. So that is permitted, and in fact being encouraged, because in most of the topic, in fact, there is not a consensus on what this is about and what relevance or significance it is. So it could be various outcomes, because if you just think that it's just my own paper, I just chop it into 7 portions, and each portion will be very insignificant. So I think that is not the best way to make a presentation. So try to think along to this direction, deliberately setting some kind of argument that may not agree with each other. That will make the presentation sort of more organic and more vivid, rather than a very boring sort of presentation of all the facts. So if you have some kind of contrasting view and some kind of debate, and I think that will make a more interesting presentation than a very plain presentation of all the factual information. So think about that. So in your paper, you can make a selection. You can make a selection. But of course, because of the 7 people, you may not have the chance to have a full process of preparation. So that's why you need some time to do the preparation. That's why we ask you to finish the paper in 3 weeks, but not more than that. So until now, and anything about the assignment, the paper, the discussion, it's not clear. So we have set seven topics. I won't repeat those topics because they are all in the the course outline with some suggested reference. If I have time, I will look up for more relevant reference. But at this moment, I don't want to burden you. But of course, if you can look up some additional relevant reference, it's the best. It's the best, because I'm not dictating your approach, your scope. So you can define your own scope, your own approach, so that you can link it up with other relevant reference. So although I set those topics, but I do not have a predefined perspective and view. So you can do whatever you like, as long as one, it makes sense, it's logical, and the other is it is based on your readings of relevant reference or empirical information. So understand that some topic you may need some factual or statistical information to support that. And that is also a demonstration of your own effort. And that will command some merit on that. So because you need to form the group, so usually I will let you to make a decision. So I have already set up a Google form, and you can register your preference. Let me show the Google form to you first. Okay, I'll send you the link. So you can fill up the Google Forms. So I'll let you to the freedom to also pick your Zoom presentation partner as well. So you can form your own group from either on your own or up to 7 in a group. But having a bigger group may not be an advantage, because I will let you to have a preference of the topic. So perhaps let me show you first. This few people would like to form into a group or just arbitrary. And they will have their first choice of P2, second choice P5. Sorry. I'll encourage you to fill out all the 7 choices. And 6. If there is a crash in the choice, I will do a lucky draw. So I will assign each of this group you form, when you can be on your own, a random number. And I will allocate your first choice to those who have a bigger random number. But I will allocate those in a group at one go. So you will be bind together in a group. But because we set a limit of 7 in a group, so if you are unlucky, you do not get a big random number, so you'll be pushed to perhaps to your second and third choice. So if you are in a group of 7, and if you do not have a very high random number, I'm sure that you'll be pushed to the bottom, because I need to fit the group into 7. So if you are already a group of 7, the only room you can fit in are those choices that nobody choose. Because if one already occupy a position in, for instance, in P1, and you choose P1 as the first choice, because you have a group of 7, you cannot fit in the P1, because then P1 have 8 people. That's not allowed. So you'll be moved to a lower priority. So you can form a team, but I'm not sure that having a big team will be advantage. So I'll give you a few days in filling that, because I want to settle that as early as possible, so that you can make the preparation earlier. So I'll send out this link tomorrow. So you can discuss among yourself whether you want to stick to any of your friends in the preparation of the presentation. But if you have no particular choice, just let the choice to such as some kind of random number to luck. So is it clear about this arrangement? So I prefer to have the deadline on next Tuesday. Is it enough? So that I will begin to have the allocation on Wednesday, and then you all know that in Friday. So for those who are on Zoom, do you have any queries or any concern on that? it doesn't matter when you enter into this form, but remember one thing, don't change other people's name. Because that is the easiest way for me to manipulate. Otherwise, I'll set up a Google form, and then you are not able to sort of manipulate such data. But directly enter into that Google Sheet make me more convenient because I don't have to handle the form. Okay. Okay, something that you have already heard 1,000 times. It's my responsibility to alert you again. Academic honesty is an attribute that we treasure the most in academic work. So plagiarism will be penalized. So you need to submit your assignment to Canvas, and we'll check your paper against the database we have in the program what we got turning in. But don't worry, we will not just look at the percentage of similarity, and we'll also set up a draft section for you to check the similarity before you make your final submission. So if you detected anything that you are not on purpose, but have some similarity with the existing so-called work of others, so either add in the citation reference or to paraphrase those writings. So that's what we require. So we understand that anything we said, supposing the original, in fact, rely on other people's findings in knowledge. So it's legitimate to take reference of other people's work as long as you acknowledge the source. So that is the principle in referencing in academic writing. So perhaps we are a little bit strict and stubborn on that, but that's the way that we respect originality and also respect other people's work. So that is also an indication that what kind of materials you have consulted and whether you are able to integrate those material in an organic way relevant to the topic we want you to do. So that's something that we want to trace that. And of course, I mean, nowadays with the advancement of technology, there's all sorts of so-called tricks that students want to fool the system. So in fact, we are also learning hard to cope with so-called those advancements in technique and technology. And believe us, I mean, we have the whole tertiary institution community to support this endeavor. So that's why there may be high chance, even if you use the most advanced trick, unless you are the first one to use, or otherwise, we already detect what you're going to do. And in fact, the latest trick we have discovered in the last few years is student commissioning an outside organization to write a paper for you. I mean, that is very, very popular. But in fact, those organizations, they need to pretend they are legal and not to be engaged in any of those litigation because we will sue them. So most of those organizations, they promise to disclose their clients' information to tertiary institution. Because for them, at least on paper, they are not replace you to do the assignment. They just help you to do the assignment. So perhaps you have already signed a contract with them that you shouldn't use that paper without your own modification as an assignment to protect themselves. So we already have cases that if you ask those organizations, they will disclose their client's information in order to prove themselves clean. So there's a risk. So I just caution you about that new development we have. But we trust you. We trust you that because you have the intention to learn. And in fact, the assignment we said should be within your ability. Of course, I mean, if you want to have sort of top grade, but your ability wouldn't reach that, that's another thing. But as long as you do not want to risk that, I'm sure that most of you are able to cope with the demand we set. Okay, that is what I want to brief you. So anything you want to follow up or anything that you want me to clarify further? So for those who attend the lecture via Zoom, do you have any problem, any questions, or any concern? You can either turn on your microphone and speak out, or you can write it on the chat box. If not, I'll set up a submission entry in Canvas and submit what you have written or drawn to that site so that I can have more information on you and know you better. I think it will help both of me and you to get along in the course. Okay, if not, let's call it a day and see you next week. But prepare next week because we have 2 sections. So perhaps the class will dismiss close to 10. So make that preparation. Particularly eat your dinner before you come, or otherwise you will be very hungry. Okay, thank you very much. For those who have drawn that, I want your picture. I want the description. Yeah, give me that. Don't worry, that will not be assessed. I don't want to keep that. Okay. Oh, very good. It's a fish. What fish? 그래서 전점有了票，泰国打游戏了，那到底是那个美国